Hi, I'm Randy Reid, Executive Director of the National Lighting Bureau. Today's session is part of our Let's Talk About Light and Health series, a collaboration between the National Lighting Bureau and Mount Sinai's Light and Health Research Center. Today's session is entitled Getting the Job Done, Lighting for the New Office Paradigm. I'm joined by Kevin Kampschroer, GSA Chief Sustainability Officer and Director, Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings, and Dr. Mark Reid of Mount Sinai's Light and Health Research Center. Gentlemen, welcome. Well, Kevin, the first one goes to you. We had your colleague, Brian Steverson, on a few months ago. Tell us a little bit about your background and GSA's overall mission, and I guess your role with the GSA.
Well, my background is I've worked in every aspect of real estate management that you can imagine, starting in security and working through high performance green buildings. My particular role in GSA right now is sort of a two-hatted role. One, I'm the director of the Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings, and our mission is to make every building in the federal inventory better than it is today, and more green, more efficient, and more healthy. And I'm also the Chief Sustainability Officer for GSA, so I have that sort of broader umbrella of making the operations of GSA net zero by 2045. And that's a daunting task. So that's who I am. I've been at GSA for 49 years.
Oh, my goodness. Well, congratulations on that longevity. It sounds like you are the right person for the right job. Mark, you were director of the Lighting Research Center at RPI for many years. Recently, of course, moved to the Light and Health Research Center at Mount Sinai. What is your current role at the LHRC?
In a word, support. I do a lot now with writing and editing proposals and manuscripts, designing experiments, and taking out the trash. As I think you know, Randy, the Light and Health Research Center has two facilities, one in New York City and one here in Albany. Mariana spends most of her time in New York. I spend most of my time here taking out the trash.
Well, I know you do everything, and you probably do take out the trash, but I do notice there's no title. I can't find a title for you anywhere. Is there an official title?
Professor.
Professor, okay.
And well, I profess whenever I can.
Okay, I like that, Professor Ray. Let me ask you about this. The LRC played a major role in the market transformation to LED light sources, helping to create standards, of course, and quality metrics for LEDs. Would you say that lighting is better today than it was maybe 20 years ago?
Yes and no. You'd have to live under a rock to not know how solid state lighting has changed, not just the technology, but the business itself. And if I look at your magazine, Designing Lighting, for example, I see designs that probably couldn't have been done with legacy lighting alone. There's a lot of flexibility, the energy efficiency, the ability to tune, all those things really came with the revolution over the last decade. And I think too, what's interesting is that I guess with the demise of the oligarchs, there's been a lot of entrepreneurship. Recently at Leducation, you could see a lot of new companies producing new products, and all that's good. But I think the disappointing part is that those new products pretty much imitate the old ones. And there really isn't a lot of innovation. And I think that comes from the standards that were created for legacy lighting. We refer to those companies as annuity businesses. They had sockets, and when the lamps burned out, they had new ones to put in, and you knew you were always going to have revenue because you just simply produced one of the few things that would go into those sockets. But the standards then still change. And until the standards change, I think we're going to continue to see a rather lackluster trend in innovation. After I went to Leducation, I think I came to the conclusion that the lighting industry has become more like the furniture industry and a lot less like technology, where innovation is king. So yes and no, Randy.
Well, may I explore that with you a little bit?
Sure.
What standards specifically do you think need to change? Can you throw one out there that you'd like to see?
Well, one of the ones that has troubled me for many years is highway safety. As long as we're providing illumination on the roadway, we're not doing anything for safety. The ability for automobiles and static lighting to interact, to improve visibility in crosswalks and things like that, there's nothing happening by the people in lighting. And of course, one of my key projects is, circadian lighting, and what a struggle that's been to try to do something that improves the health of building occupants, which is fairly simple. You just got to make bright days and dim nights, and you're going to make a huge impact on society and the well-being of the people. So until that changes, I don't see anything more than new furniture coming out.
All right. Kevin, continuing this theme, with the widespread transformation of fluorescent to LED light sources, some have said that energy efficiency is no longer as important as it used to be. So, question first, what's your view of that statement? And second, do you think that lighting energy requirements for GSA buildings will be further lowered, or will they pretty much stay the same?
Maybe three answers to two questions.
Okay.
We'll start with the easy one. We intend to continue increasing the efficiency of our buildings, which means our standards will say less energy as we go forward. So we will not say that energy efficiency is not important as we go forward. What we will say is that with LED lighting becoming more and more ubiquitous, it's more difficult to get more energy efficient. It used to be that the easy thing to do was replace the lights, didn't cost a whole lot of money, and you saved a lot of energy. We can't do that very much anymore. The second thing I will say is that I will agree with Mark on the state of innovation in part. From a building owner and operator point of view, the innovation is a little lacking, but there's still so much work to be done in existing buildings that we can innovate with the systems that are coming out anyway. And we can do circadian lighting, and we can do that. The key is the control systems, and the control systems is where the innovation and the standardization is not what I would hope it to be. I think that control systems can be much better, and more importantly, they need to be more turnkey for the people who are operating the buildings. We get very complicated systems in there. I was touring a building and there was a lighting manufacturer in the building. I won't even mention who it was. And they said, you've got our system in the building and you're only using about 20% of its capability. And why is that? So I went back to the building manager and I asked him, I had this guy here and he said this, and he said, I might be using 20% of the capability, but it's 100% more than I had 2 years ago. So we make steps forward, but the real problem is that we deliver to building managers systems that are so complex that they're very, very difficult to keep running and keep well. So the control systems need to be made easier to use, easier to understand, better user controls. And the other thing is, you got to tell the people who are living in the building how the system works and why it's good for them to let the system work the way it's supposed to work. If you don't tell them, what good are you doing?
Well, it's interesting. And we've been talking about this for 20 years about controls. I will say from some of the webinars that I've sat in and some of the shows I've attended, I do think the controls are getting better. And they are more user friendly. There's still more work to be done. We hear a lot about healthy buildings, and Kevin, this one's to you also. You once said that GSA wasn't so much concerned with healthy buildings, but healthy occupants. How does that vision affect the policy with GSA, and how do you pair lighting energy efficiency with healthy building occupants?
It's a very, very topical discussion because people believe, falsely, I think, that there is a trade-off. You know, you can have a healthy building or you can have an energy efficient building, but you can't have both. And I would posit that, yes, you can have both. You just have to know how to do it and how to do it well. This comes up a lot in ventilation. You know, what do we want? We want more fresh air and we want cleaner fresh air. So we want higher degrees of filtration. Higher degrees of filtration mean you have, you know, a greater pressure drop as you're going across the filter, and that costs energy. But then you make up for the energy by putting UV light on the coil, making the system more efficient in different kinds of ways. And you do the same thing with lighting. Circadian lighting, you know, a dim building in the evening is much cheaper to operate than a brightly lit building in the evening. And what we want for circadian light, to use the pithy phrase of Mark that he used earlier, you want a bright building in the morning when there's plenty of daylight, and you want a dim building in the evening when there isn't so much. And so that's actually a more energy efficient way to run the building than the standard turn them all on. And by the way, let's get the controls right so that the lights don't go on when you walk into a room. People will figure out if they need light. They should have to walk over to a switch. They should have to do work to turn the light on. The only thing the system needs to do is turn the light on when they leave, off when they leave.
Okay, I like that approach. And let me ask you, would you have any idea of the buildings that you're responsible for? What percent have controls that are properly being utilized? Do you have any idea?
Well, I don't have any idea about the controls for lighting alone, but I have a very good idea on the overall building automation system controls, because we've just done an audit, and it's a surprisingly high number that are pretty well controlled and pretty well used, 60%. That leaves a lot of room for improvement, but I would say I would put that 60% up against any other portfolio owner in the country, because it's actually pretty good. And when you consider that that's 60%, including buildings that the building automation system is an on-off switch.
Sure. That's much higher than I thought. So congratulations.
Yeah, no, it was surprising to me how high it was. And this was with audits that we did with the national labs that are run by the Department of Energy. So I'm very confident in the number.
Mark, what do you see as some of the major barriers to supporting healthy building occupants?
Well, as I noted previously, the standards support legacy lighting, and we need, in my opinion, standards and guidelines that really support things like safety, health. And I have to say, GSA is a leader. You've already heard about building automation systems, but you know, they're not just sitting around. They're creating literally standards and guidelines for people to use. Kevin's colleague, Brian Steverson, is out in Denver today, in fact, looking at how that circadian effective lighting might be introduced to correspond with the guidelines that were developed by GSA. I think that, in fact, leadership from the outside, like Kevin Kampschroer, is what it's going to take to induce that innovation in lighting. I really don't see it. I'm reminded of that Pogo cartoon from the 60s that said, "We have met the enemy and he is us," when it comes to the lighting industry. And I think, again, there's nothing but praise for people like Kevin and Brian, who are really making that change by creating new standards and guidelines. That's what's needed, I think.
Well, Kevin, the pandemic has changed the modern office, I think, forever. And with the move from working every day in an office building to more remote work from home, how is GSA's healthy building occupants research, I guess, translating into strategies that federal employees can use at home and at the office?
That's a great question. We're working on that. In fact, we're holding this week our first, I won't call it a symposium, but just a discussion on that exact topic. We are concerned about, you know, what happens wherever you work. How do we as a good employer help people have good working environments at home, good working environments at the office, and good working environments in between. I remember several years ago, a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon University, Vivian Loftus, said, you know, the way I get corporate executives to understand how buildings affect health is I sort of walk them through how much they would be willing to pay for a really high-class luxury car, and what are the features and everything else. And she said, you know, I can get them to list 50, 60, 70 brainstorming ideas. What makes a really great luxury car? When I ask what makes a good, healthy building, I get 2, 3, 4, and it's sort of the knowledge. One of the things that it's worth knowing is that the average person with an average car in the United States has more control over the environment in that car than they do at home or at work. And so, you know, I'm trying to push for more control and more understanding of what you need. We've done a lot, and the pandemic, you're right, has changed forever the landscape. We've done a lot with people, you know, trying to make sure that the connectivity works, trying to make sure that we understand Zoom works. We understand, you know, the helpful hints like the one you gave me before we started this conversation about, you know, don't forget where your camera is, Kevin. You know, don't be looking off down here because, you know, and it's the little things like that, those hints, and it's kind of like, you know, you can see on the camera, do you have good lighting in your place? Are you remembering that the computer is its own source of light? Are you remembering how it is that you work differently? I mean, one of the things that happened for me personally is that I've gone back to taking notes on paper because I can't use my computer because I have a new interaction with my computer, and it's called, in this particular today, it's called Zoom, or it's called WebEx, or it's called, you know, Google Meet, or, you know, any of the other brands, and that's our interaction with people. So how do we become more deliberate in our understanding of how it is when we interact with other people in this new environment? And how is it that we can get the physical environment to support us both mentally and physically so that we can do our jobs? I mean, one of the things I invested in here at home was a standing desk. I'm standing right now because I need a little bit more stretching and exercise because I sat down all morning long. So it goes up, it goes down. Not everybody can afford that. Companies need to be investing in that for their employees. They need to be investing in, you know, ergonomics is not new, but it's a little bit, you know, Mark mentioned the furniture industry before. We're still putting out chairs and forgetting to tell people that they can be adjusted, right? And what's the point of an ergonomic chair if you don't even know it can be adjusted? You say, oh, well, they gave it to me like this, I got to use it. So it's all of this whole package of things that need to be put together. One of the good things about most people's home environment, though, is they can open the windows. Would you buy a home that you couldn't open the windows in? Yet how many offices do we go to that are completely sealed?
Sure. And then there are some people in these inner cities and they can't open their windows. And that just breaks my heart.
Yeah, because of the environment. And, you know, and if you live in Beijing or a place like that where the outside air is not exactly the cleanest in the world, do you really want to bring that air in? So it's got to be filtered. And so that's where the building is, you know, intercedes on behalf of the health of the people because it filters the air.
Hey, sure, I understand that. Mark, let me ask you, you've been a fan of local lighting for years. Can a local lighting strategy be used to support health for people who work in the office and at home?
Yes, absolutely. And it really touches on the point about the office and the home office and the work office, that local lighting, I think, is a really powerful way to do that. We just completed a study literally last week, funded by the McClung Foundation, one of the few that around to support lighting research. And we found that you can deliver high circadian effective lighting with local lighting and get power densities down to 0.15 watts per square foot, which is far in excess of what are far better than what even ASHRAE is recommending.
Right.
I mean, the inverse square law is your friend when you get the light close to you. And I want to make a point, which Kevin did. We did that without glare, low power density. And I think that what's really interesting, we've been working with the American Lighting Association, as you know, Randy, with manufacturers that are now coming up with fixtures, local lighting fixtures that are glare-free, energy efficient, deliver the circadian effective light, and they look good. And I think that's the kind of innovation we need both in offices and in home. And quit trying to put everything in the ceiling. I think that's a huge change. It's a game changer, I think.
Okay, Kevin, any closing comments before we open the floor to questions?
Yes, I think that lighting is a paradox for most people. You see it all the time, but you don't notice it. And the whole idea, if we're going to get any point across, is think about what you see, even when you're not noticing what you see, because you can make that work for you even better. And circadian light would be the number one thing I would tell people to work on. Make sure that these phones switch away to a calmer color in the evening. Make sure that you don't even look at them when you're trying to fall asleep. I mean, the craziest thing in the world is trying to be reading the screen, which is making you stay awake, and you're trying to fall asleep. Just recognize the human body has some limitations, and that's one of them.
Okay, good point. Mark, closing comments?
Well, I'd like to do a repetitive shout out to General Service Administration. We've been working with them for quite a while and supporting research, field research in particular, to demonstrate the value of circadian effective lighting. But as I said before, it takes leadership, I think, from the outside to actually make the changes in lighting or HVAC or anything else. And I think Kevin and Brian have been terrific leaders in this whole transformation. So I applaud GSA for that kind of vision and actually doing something instead of just talking about it.
Sure. Okay.
Yes. He's forced me to make one further word. You don't do anything good or dramatic by yourself. You do it by collaborating with great partners. It takes a lot of people working together, and that's what makes new standards excellent. That's what makes for innovation. So let's keep working together and keep moving things forward.
Okay, excellent. We will now open the floor for questions. Thank you very much. And Allison, before you start looking at the questions, I have a question that I'd like to ask for Kevin, just kind of following up. Kevin, you mentioned about the symposium, kind of discussing home office and good workers at home and how to give them a good working environment. Do you ever foresee a day that the GSA might provide portable or local lights to employees to have at their home?
I do. I can't sort of commit the federal government to spending money on that scale, but right now we are evolving. When the pandemic started, we were very, very good at being able to transition, make sure everybody could work from home. The laptop was the thing. People said, you know, I'm used to going into the office and having an extra screen. Well, for the first year of the pandemic, we didn't have the money or the wherewithal to get the extra screen. Now, it's relatively standard for people at home to get an extra screen. So we're evolving in that regard. So I think that we make a good argument for that. I'll give you a parallel situation. We're willing to make some ventilation improvements in people's home because we've discovered that there's a little portable fan. I wish I had a picture of it. I could, or a physical device. You plug it into the USB part, and it blows fresh air across the breathing zone. And that movement of air, turns out, reduces carbon dioxide inhalation significantly. And it's really, really inexpensive. And it costs nothing to operate, basically, because it's running off the USB port of your computer. So lighting, I think, can get to that stage as well. So I would predict that certainly within the next few years, we will be looking for it. What we're looking for to do that is some really good evidence. This is the value proposition. This is what it does. And this is why we need to do it. And in a way that I can explain it to people that I work with, that I can explain it to people at home to make them want this device.
Okay, very good. And then let me also ask you another question, if I may. So you said 60% of the buildings, the GSA have some sort of overall building automation. Now we're in 2023. I'd like for you to think about 5 years from now, 2028. What percent of GSA buildings do you think by that time will have building automation?
Let's talk about 2030.
Okay, all right, close enough.
The only reason I say 2030 is we have a lot of goals in the federal government for doing things by 2030. And so what we're really interested in doing is making sure that we understand what our goals are. So by 2030, I would expect that in GSA's own inventory, which is one piece of the federal government as a whole, every building will be connected to a building automation system that will be connected to a central network. Every single building by 2030. Now, we don't have a huge number of buildings. Would that happen in the Department of Defense with 10 times as many buildings on different military bases? No, because they have different issues. But for GSA, 100% by 2030.
Okay, very good. Allison, I'll turn it over to you now if you have a question.
Yeah. So, Kevin, you mentioned that we want building occupants to turn on their own lights during the day, but also be able to save energy at night by having lower levels. So can you clarify, will the controls know to have, when you turn on the lights during the day, are they going to be brighter? And then when lights turn on at night, are they going to be dimmer? Is there a strategy for that?
I should hope so. The strategy that I use at home is we have 3 light switches in the bedroom, and I only use the 2 low intensity lights at night, and I use the big one, with all the fluorescent during the day in the morning. So that's sort of because I know, because of my work with Mark and others at the center, that it's good for me, and so on and so forth. But I do that. Do my wife and daughter do the same thing? I'm not so sure. We'll see. So, but in buildings, we really do need to get those controls right. I would say that most of the time during the day, you don't need electric light anyway in most buildings, because there's lights coming in from the window, and there's probably more light than you need. And an excess of light, it's a fascinating psychological problem, because once the light is turned on, people don't want to get rid of it. But if it's not turned on at all, if you just sort of go into a meeting and watch people come in and you deliberately turn the lights off in the room, you'll find that 80% of the time, nobody will ask for more light because there's plenty. And we can see a lot. There was an interesting experiment that I participated, well, it wasn't, I was just in the audience in the American Institute for Architects, and they were talking about this exact subject. And the speaker had arranged to turn all the lights off in the room, including the projection and everything else. And he kept talking, and he said, "Now I'm just going to talk for about 2 minutes and wait." And they said, now I want you to look up on the stage. How many of you can see me? And it's like 85% of people in completely dark, no daylight room could see, because there's the eye is an amazing organ. It really can adapt to so much that you can see. You don't need nearly as much light as people think. And that's sort of it. Mark talked in the video about the legacy standards. That's one of the legacy standards. We ask for too much light. We don't need it.
We have a question now from Ryan Walker, and Ryan asks, are there strategies to educate building owners who think that circadian lighting is a nice to have and not a must have?
Well, I hope so. Part of the research that we've done together really shows the economic value to employers. And it's not, you sort of need to take a building owner through a thought experiment, and the problem is there's so many people involved, right? That who goes to the building, work for a company, the company has invested a lot in that person and then that person's productivity, and that company cares whether the person is getting the kind of support they need to work. The building owner only cares that the company renews the lease. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in whom you need to talk to, but you need to talk to the occupants and say, this is what you need to demand from the building owner, because it's good for me as a company, it's good for me as an employee of a company, it's good for me as a manager or a leader of this company to have people who get better rest at night. And the thing is that, as our colleague Esther Sternberg says, you take your building home with you. So what happens in the building during the day bleeds over into the evening, and it bleeds over into your sleep quality. And one of the studies that we did with the Lighting and Health Research Center is to look at the effect of circadian light on sleep. And you get people who are more well rested, the equivalent of an hour more sleep as a result of these things. And you say to an employer, you say, do you want somebody who's well rested, or do you want somebody who's worn out? And it's not a tough decision for them to make. So it's making that connection between the tenant and the building owner to get the building owner to understand this is something that we want, we value, and we need.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, Mark, you were talking at the end there about quit putting everything in the ceiling. And I just thought for a moment, with our magazine, Designing Lighting, I am able to look at some of the best jobs really in the world, best lighting jobs, and everything is in the ceiling. Everything is in the ceiling. And these are by some of the best, highest regarded lighting designers out there. What do we need to do to convince them to start doing that?
Well, I think one of the problems we've had in the research that we've done with GSA is that if you want something local, you got to build it yourself. And so I think one of the real positive steps has been the American Lighting Association beginning to work with us to come up with designs that are not only circadian effective, but nice looking. We got this summer, we're going to be evaluating a number of those, and I think they can be translated into the office. But I want to echo what Kevin said. We need to tell people. I just want to just say one thing, Kevin, about what you said, if I may, and is that you're absolutely right. The visual system is amazing. It can go from starlight all the way out to a sunny beach. But that's not the system we're talking about. And in fact, you're largely unconscious of the effects it has for circadian regulation. And so I think, again, like diet and exercise, you've got to educate people on what is the appropriate behavior to do, because they wouldn't necessarily do it naturally. So I think we have to, there's a tension there. There's no question. I see fine, but that may be in biological darkness. And I think that's the educational piece that GSA is already working on.
Okay, Allison, do you want to ask the next question that we have?
Yeah, and Mark, just to go a little further on that last point, what, because Kevin's point is, well, we can see the person or we can see what we're working on, so that should be good enough, which is good enough for the visual system. But what tips do we give people for it to be bright enough to actually stimulate our circadian system?
Well, I mean, it's 10,000 steps a day by analogy, right? We need to let people know that this bright light in the morning is particularly relevant, and maybe keep track of their thing on their watch, for example, like, oh, I got my 2 hours of bright light today, for example. I think that's the kind of thing we need to do. Keep it simple, make sure it's effective. It won't fix everybody's sleep problems, obviously, but it certainly goes in the right direction.
Okay.
So we have Ali has a hand raised, so I'm gonna unmute you if you can ask your question.
The question or the notion was talked about a little bit by Mark here, because photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that are sensitive, that are working for the circadian system are different. The light detection for them takes longer time, and they need a lot more light. So vision light, which we sort of detected in a matter of milliseconds, are different than this other sort of class of photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. That said, most buildings are actually, as an architect, I can tell you, most buildings are not done well in terms of daylight to accommodate that. Most buildings are not designed well in terms of daylight to accommodate that. So at this point, you have to think about some sort of supplementary electric light as well as the daylight. But I think as architects, we need to design buildings better to accommodate better daylight into the design. That's it.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree with you totally. Your point is we're working on very different timescales between milliseconds and minutes or hours. And Randy, you need a video to go minutes and hours rather than just snapshots, right? That can convey the circadian effectiveness of the lighting, see what the changes. But I think that I just want to caution everybody to think daylight is the panacea for everything. If you get outside and you're a farmer or construction worker, that's probably true. But managing daylight coming into a building is not trivial. We've done a lot of studies to show that the north face, without direct sunlight, generally where you're going to save most of your energy and get most of your circadian effective light, because people pull the blinds. Kevin had said earlier that they don't monitor it much, but the one thing they will pay attention to in their seat is if there's sunlight coming onto their desk, they will get out of their chair and they'll go adjust the blinds. Otherwise, whatever the electric lighting does just isn't interesting enough for people. So I think that we have to be really smart about daylight. I'm not saying anything that people haven't said before, but I'm surprised how many times people miss the point that these buildings are occupied and these people don't want direct sunlight coming into their face or their workstation. And that always seems to be ignored. And I've never fully grasped why that is. But daylight is not the panacea that it may be perceived to be.
I think I'll add on to that. It's not the panacea. And as Elise said, it's not very well managed by architectural design. And in many cases, it's not just the building that's the problem. It's the furniture placement. We did a 100% daylit building in Portland. This is one of the ones we worked on together, Mark, and discovered that as soon as they put the furniture in there, the daylighting stopped 10 feet inside the windows because the partitions were in the way and the people in the interior didn't get any of the benefit of the daylighting, which we measured when the space was empty of furniture, and it was, all the way to the core of the building. So a lot of it is getting all of the disciplines together, and we find over and over again, whether it's ventilation or daylighting or lighting in general, that the furniture design can be an extraordinary impediment to things working as they're supposed to, because a lot of times it's not integrated into the design in the first place, or people are using leftover furniture or stuff like that. So it's all of these things together. But I would just underscore what Mark said. Daylighting is not a panacea when you're inside. Daylighting probably is a panacea if you're outside.
Randy had mentioned designing lighting, and this is one of the things that I think we have to come to grips with, both in architecture and lighting design. You win a design generally by the photography that is taken. That's a snapshot. And if you notice, they almost never have people in it. So exactly what Kevin said, it looks great. You do your calculations, you make your measurements, then those damn people come in and ruin it. And I think that has to be conceptualized more, I think, both for lighting designers and by architects. So.
Right. All right, Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, we have a nice question from Ryan. I'm not sure if he wants to ask out loud.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone be here. This has been very educational. So I live in Seattle, Washington, very gray for most of the year. And Washington State is implementing the Washington State Green Building Act over the next few years, requiring buildings over 50,000 square feet to implement energy performance standards. And if buildings don't meet those standards, they begin to get fined. And over the years, the fines get larger. Are there any national initiatives from GSA encouraging healthier lighting or green practices?
So the answer is yes from GSA. We don't control private buildings, but we try to lead by example. And we have the standards for sustainable federal buildings. They're available publicly. Make sure that you have a link before this is over. With any luck, my colleague Brian Stevenson will plug that link in there to those standards. And we're looking to implement them systematically across the government. Secondly, I think that the leadership in this area is coming from the cities, principally, and some state governments as well. Certainly, the first city, I think that well, I live in Washington, D.C. They had an interesting take on it. They basically said, we understand permitting is a process, and it's a long and difficult process here in the city. But if you're going to do a green building, we'll put you to the front of the line. And taking a year off of the approval process in permitting is enough to really incentivize people. So that was, I thought, very clever here. And Mayor Bloomberg, and when he was the mayor of New York City, sort of really said, you know, let's look at where it really matters. And I think you sort of implied this is that buildings over 50,000 square feet, you know, that less than 10% of the buildings in New York City are over 50,000 square feet, but they consume over 70% of the energy. So focus on the big buildings where it matters. And they did their focus not with fines, but with, shall we say, publicizing. We're going to put that stuff out there so that everybody can look at it. And I can tell you it worked because the Chrysler building, when they're the iconic building in New York, when their first publicly available energy consumption showed up, it was more than 2.5 times that of the Empire State Building. And it radically changed their approach to, they said, we don't, look, this is our competitor. We can't do that. So you get this kind of competition going. And so there's lots of different ways. Do I think that there's going to be a national energy standard? Honestly, do you know how many states don't have an energy code at all? It's a surprising number. Well, you know, maybe close to half of the states don't have an energy code on their books. So a big national initiative, no, but lots of local initiatives, yes. And again, I think those local initiatives led by the cities by and large, and to the extent we will.
Okay, before we wrap up, are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay, well, hearing none, we will go ahead and close. And I want to thank our panelists, Kevin and Mark, for attending. Brian did send that link for the sustainability, so we will get that to the video. We will have the video edited, and we will post it on the NLB website, and we will also post it on the Edison report. Thank you all.